So embodied realism, and does this constitute the opportunity for a new aesthetic for art science? Well, in its narrow 18th century usage, the term aesthetic related primarily to contemplation of beauty in art and nature. However, our approach to the field of aesthetics has gradually broadened to qualify not only judgments and evaluations, but properties, attitudes, values, experience and pleasure far beyond the original realm of visual beauty. To the point where Cubitt and Quastek can now talk of a contemporary interactional digital aesthetic. As Foucault recognised, the 20th century has developed a far more multifaceted understanding that encourages permeable boundaries and richer interconnections, inviting questions as to whether Descartes' disembodied realism, based on an absolute distinction between objective and subjective, really does offer a credible basis for conceptualizing mental and physical interactions between ourselves and the world through our experiences, artifacts and arguments. The time is therefore ripe, I think, to revisit the Enlightenment's foundational classification of art and science as orthogonal activities, with the one never able to cast illumination on the other. The main point of departure for the new generation of hybrid art science practitioners over the earlier sci-art counterparts is that artists are now actively seeking to create research partnerships with the various scientific communities, rather than simply passively reflecting science-inspired motifs in their work. Similarly, scientists are beginning to appreciate much more clearly the value of building working relationships with artists in roles and projects beyond those of routine scientific illustration or public engagement. The art science agenda, as outlined in the transdisciplinary journal Leonardo, which of course is one of the sponsors of the latest event, aims for a broader and more integrated engagement across a wide range of societal and global problems, from food and water provision and security, through improved attitudes to health and general well-being, to a more sustainable long-term attitude to ethical trade, social structures and management of our local and planetary environment. However, despite art science's early signs of promise and vigour, for it to gain real traction as an enduring cultural and educational phenomenon, there is still a pressing need to develop stronger theoretical underpinnings to deal with questions and misconceptions that will inevitably arise when creating a workable partnership between the sensibilities of the arts and sciences. So in this presentation, I want to briefly explore how embodied realism, recently reimagined and extended by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson in their book Philosophy in the Flesh, can provide analytical leverage for creating an embodied aesthetic framework for the emergent art science movement, applicable to both its artistic and scientific practitioners. The popular distinction between scientists as discoverers of pre-existing knowledge objects embedded in some form of theory-neutral external reality ripe for the picking contrasts strongly with artists who are viewed, in the popular imagination, as conjuring up subjective works from within their own minds. This view has a long history, with scientists' discoveries and artists' creativity protected via two entirely separate legal pathways: patents for scientists and copyright for artists. The intellectual and industrial expansion in the West that characterized the 17th century European Enlightenment program was crucially dependent on the disenchantment of science, in which matter effectively became de-animated, but it did not depend on the idea of objectivity. As Gallison compellingly describes, mechanical and structural objectivity were only adopted in scientific inquiry around 1830, following the previous truth-to-nature standpoint, and only lasted for just over a century before evolving into the current ideas of expert judgment. Yet the notion of objectivity still imparts a powerful influence on what contemporary scientists, artists, and the public often take to be modernity, where utility is expected of science and technology to fuel never-ending consumer growth, and art is still seen in some quarters as an aesthetic expression of intersubjective knowledge, personally created by the artist in relation to wider cultural norms. Even though many of the practicing artists and scientists now work together on mutually inspired art-science projects, there can still be a strong divergence in their underlying ontological and epistemological frameworks. However, there are now intriguing pointers from second-generation cognitive science suggesting that the conceptual and perceptual mechanisms by which artists and scientists see their respective worlds are probably not so different after all. So how have we arrived at our present ideas regarding how we as individuals know and experience a world external to ourselves? Integral to this question is whether we consider our mind and its conceptual processes to be somehow different and separate from our physical brain, body, and the outside world, i.e. disembodied, or whether we consider the process of thinking, reasoning, and experiencing to be intimately connected to our physical brain and body, situated in a network of other broadly similar organisms, i.e. not just physically embodied in an individual sense, but socially and culturally embodied as well. Such a question directly challenges Descartes' view that the conscious reasoning of an individual is always able to know and reflect on itself without any reference to external experience, in contrast to being largely an unconscious process whose characteristics are broadly shared by all humans. Such a disembodied approach to what there is and what we can know meant that object and subject became foundational categories of Western analytic philosophy, seeming to legitimize in retrospect our polarized approach to art and science in the first place. Consequently, it has been virtually impossible in modernity to discuss any underlying qualities or values that art and science might share, since they were framed as orthogonal domains with neither able to inform the other. Even under the more skeptical attitudes of postmodernity, we still struggle to discuss any potential aesthetic of science, preferring to attack it primarily for its presumed privileged narrative, rather than seeking to question and reformulate its disembodied tradition. Aesthetic considerations are sometimes raised in philosophy of science when discussing theory formation, but having been mentioned once, they generally disappear from the stage quite quickly. This is unfortunate, given that they play an acknowledged role whenever new theories are argued over by the scientific community. So what has happened to challenge the orthogonal orientation between earlier attitudes to art and science, and that has helped fuel the growth of art science? Many of the changes have arisen through the reformulation of second-generation cognitive science and can be broadly summarized under three headings: Bayesian Constructs, Conceptual Metaphors, and Embodied Realism. Human perceptions in general are now being viewed as provisional hypothetical frameworks, or Bayesian constructs, that we all unconsciously adopt to test incoming sensory data for potential meaning and inconsistencies. Normally, we remain unaware that we treat perceptions as working hypotheses, i.e. informed guesses, but instead accept them as true and accurate data provided by our eyes as cameras. Occasionally, we feel the struggle when two different hypotheses fit the data equally feasibly, as with certain optical illusions, for example. Here, our brains consider each of the two possibilities in turn, giving us the distinct impression of jumping between two alternate yet equally valid views of the world. As the noted neurosurgeon Ramachandran notes, it's as if each of us is hallucinating all the time, and what we call perception involves merely selecting the one hallucination that best matches the current input. Bayesian constructs also play a role in a related visual phenomenon that will be familiar to most practicing artists, that of colour constancy. We retain a sense of continuity of colour within scenes, even when they are bathed in highly coloured illumination, as with strong sunlight causing a deep coloured shadow cast over a white shirt, for example. Yet colours as we think of them do not exist in the external world. The sky is not blue, the grass is not green, and curtains are not red. Our experience of colour is created by the way a number of key factors interact: electromagnetic illumination, surface reflectance, retinal receptors in our eyes, and the complex neural networks within our brains that these feed into. All these must be present to create the impression of colour, making the sensation of colour both embodied and interactional, rather than strictly objective or purely subjective. When illuminated by different light sources, the wavelength of light reflected by the grass, for example, will be considerably different, but it still appears more or less the same colour to us. Linguistic metaphors don't just enrich our daily verbal and written exchanges, they also act as fundamental conceptual elements across the arts and humanities. Science, however, has only belatedly and rather grudgingly come to appreciate the role metaphors play in creating its own tools and influencing its distinctive way of seeing the world. Appropriate metaphors and analogies help artists, scientists, and other practitioners to link experience, intuition, and imagination when erecting conceptual scaffolding, a metaphor of course, for moving into new realms of the not yet known or experienced, where literal language on its own may be insufficient to fuel imagination. A well-chosen metaphor is capable of creating understanding in a way that literal language often fails to do, and can illuminate and sustain fertile new direction for studies. No single conceptual model need aspire to be a complete description of reality, capable of capturing all the various observations that might be made. Scientists happily use different atomic metaphors when considering the physical and chemical properties of matter, for example. Our use of metaphors is not just a vernacular feature, but extends much deeper into the way we frame, describe, and construct a surprisingly high proportion of our fundamental concepts. Stephen Mithen maintains that conceptual metaphors are an essential part of the toolkit modern humans have evolved over their prehistoric ancestors to support abstract thought in general, and without which our imagination and conceptual plasticity would be severely constrained. As like often Johnson illustrates throughout Philosophy in the Flesh, a very high proportion of these imaginative metaphors share characteristics that relate directly to the way we experience and interact with the immediate physical world around us through our bodies and associated senses. They contend that metaphors underpin a surprising number of the concepts that we pre-reflectively take as literal. Their argument is that the cognitive content of the cognitive content of the metaphor, in distinction to its literal meaning, which of course must always be false, can hold true by virtue of successful mapping from one domain of experience to another. Our bodily experiences are a uniquely powerful influence on our thought processes, providing most of the domain content for one side of nearly all possible cognitive metaphors. Seeing the point, illuminating the problem, clouding the issue, I can't grasp your meaning, holding my attention, and so on, being usages drawn from the bodily experiences of vision and touch, projected into the realm of pure cognition. We're now in a position to construct an embodied aesthetic for art science that was not possible under an earlier disembodied relationship. But what shape should this take? Western aesthetic practices have broadened in form and focus over the last generation, first to include diverse categories such as the natural and built environments, and almost any design activity that affects our lives through sensuous qualities such as size, shape, colour, smell, texture, etc. Aesthetics is now taken broadly to include interaction with, rather than simply contemplation of, everyday artifacts and environments that engage our senses on either a consciously noticed or unconscious level. By progressing to a more performative notion of aesthetics that embraces our individual and social behaviour and attitudes towards others, both human and non-human, the West is eventually catching up with societies in other parts of the supposedly underdeveloped world. Guattari's notion of ecosophy comes to mind here, with its three overlapping ecological fields of self, society and environment. However, we also need to be cautious. Broadening our aesthetic gaze to bring within its remit everyday acts of the mundane raise the potential danger, as Sean Cubitt warns us, of legitimation of the useless commodity. Corporate exploitation of possessive individualism creates traps for those trying to comprehend the emerging digital economy and any aesthetic shift associated with it. Hopefully, through an embodied aesthetic, art science will be able to deploy its moral and ethical dimensions to challenge the often brutal acts of economic colonialism enforced in the name of technoscience by both multinational corporations and sovereign entities. Digital technologies undoubtedly offer huge new creative opportunities across the arts, but we must remember that entropy demands that a price be extracted for the infinite reproducibility of digital imagery in all its forms, and the currency will probably be in cultural and ideological watchfulness. Digital and broadband technologies free large entertainment corporations from directly merchandising physical media, allowing them instead to exploit the far more lucrative online subscription retail model that binds customers contractually over time and engenders a form of tribal brand identity. Hopefully, the embodied aesthetics of art science should seek to create new opportunities to help persuade artists and designers, among others, that a creative career in the new digital age does not necessarily mean simply being railroaded into a dystopian future, restricted to producing adverts and jingles for faceless finance and insurance funds, creating content for international news megaliths, or YouTube diversions for the ideological foot soldiers of Fortune 500 companies. I'm trying to offer a glimpse of how an embodied aesthetic for art science could be conceptualized were we to replace Descartes' framework of disembodied realism with one based on an embodied approach, more in tune with the digital age and advances in second-generation cognitive science. Given the stated commitments of art science, it is almost certain that it will embrace far more inclusive notions of moral and ethical considerations to replace the analytical, rational actor model based purely on self-interest that is current within Western neoliberal economies as the basis for decision-making. Being able to ask, is this policy in the long-term interests of the planet and its inhabitants, is a far more powerful and democratic form of decision-making than simply having to accept technological developments simply because they are imposed by largely unquestioned economic norms backed up by an anachronistic and disembodied form of aesthetics developed several centuries ago in a very different intellectual age. Well, thank you for listening, and if I could just offer a very brief plug, as Heather has said, Many of the members from Project Dialogue wrote chapters in this book, which I edited with Barbara Hawkins and Stuart Sin, that was published last year. I've got a couple of copies with me this evening at reduced price. I think they're £15 rather than the £20 that in bookshops. I'd like to thank the artists who gave permission for me to use their images in this presentation. They were all associated with Project Dialogue. Thank you very much, and any questions?
So, obviously there's so much...
Hold on a second, so that the camera can pick it up.
There's so much density to this talk that I really only want to cherry pick one aspect if I can, which is the difficulty of selection of metaphor. Because that's, I think, one of the hardest challenges that science has.
Yes.
Where, for example, the modern series of Horizon programs just attempts to be pure, exciting, visual, interactive metaphor that has really no resemblance at all to the underlying science.
Yes.
And the fact that some disciplines of science simply defy appropriate metaphors full stop. How do these challenges get dealt with, do you think?
A transdisciplinary approach, a cross-disciplinary approach, I think is the key here, but it will take quite some time. Part of the problem, I think, is that most scientists have very little, somewhere between very little and zero, background in philosophy of science. Most of what they pick up is a sort of reverse engineered from their daily experiences and being immersed in the culture of science. And so they're not always aware, I think, that science has such a strong metaphorical base. The programs that, like the Horizon programs that you mentioned, many of them which are excellent, but if you listen to them with a linguist's ear, they are a series, almost a never-ending series of metaphors in order to try and describe what's going on. And yet the presenters never really seem to have cottoned on to the fact that the structure itself is based on the metaphorical, I think almost has been a metaphorical link between the conceptual models that underlie science and the hard daily graft in the lab or wherever of undertaking the experiments. And it's trying to make that the bridge so that people are a little more willing to say what if in terms of their theoretical constructs. We see it in certain areas. For example, you see it a lot at the moment in the difficult areas of dark matter, because they're in the position of having almost only unstructured sensory information. And without any conceptual models, you can't make much sense of it. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit there. Does that?
Well, no, I mean, it's the start of a long discussion.
Yes.
Would anyone else like to pick up on this question? Yes.
This isn't a question, it's just to amplify something queried just by the last speaker, which was that I would like to refer people to the two books by Martin Kemp, philosopher of science and of art history. One is called Visualizations, the other Seen Unseen. He does tackle those questions of metaphor very thoroughly and very beautifully, actually, particularly in relation to acculturation in the way that we interpret meaning, create meaning or assign meaning to the visual world, the observed world. Acculturation, he also believes, as it seems that he believes that we as humans share certain fundamental metaphorical understandings, but he also separates out those differences between cultures and of course, individual personal memory.
Yes, I had
Martin Kemp.
an interesting discussion with him about 6 months ago in Oxford on that very.
That must have been
great
really
point.
interesting.
It was
Lucky you.
interesting.
So yes, for anyone who isn't familiar with that, author Martin Kemp, one book called Visualizations and the other called Seen Unseen. They're both about 10 years old, but they are absolutely brilliant, beautifully written. Thank you. I really enjoyed the lecture, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Sorry. I think the question of metaphor is actually it's really good and it's really powerful, but it's important. So I'm a teacher with a background in science that's worked as an artist and that still works as an artist. The problem I have when I communicate anything scientific to my students with metaphor is that they make an association that's personal and they don't understand the function of the metaphor in terms of understanding something technical about how the way the world works. So there still has to be a kind of, it almost has to be like a sort of interpretation, a way of interpreting the metaphor that has to be in place before you can even start to approach it, because I think people interpret them in very poetic, very personal ways. And I mean, even with there's as well as Martin Kemp's book, it's Frank Wilczek's book, A Beautiful Question, which is really interesting, I think overly aesthetic, but his whole scientific research is completely discussed in terms of metaphor, because it's all tiny particles and they're described as red and green and blue, and people start thinking about wavelengths of colour when these particles are smaller than a photon. And I question as to whether we get too carried away with aesthetics and too carried away with the feeling of inspiration that you get from metaphor, and that's really nice, but to the meaning that what we end up with is sort of confusion. So I don't know, that's just my concern. It's not really a question, but how does that work in education, in like for kids, for teenagers essentially? So how does that work? They still don't get gravity, by the way. Anyway.
In many ways, it's a simple question, but the simplest questions are always the hardest to answer in this respect. I don't have a simple answer, a simple formula that can be used to offer for use in teaching, because there are so many different ways that people understand, as you say, the underlying metaphoric structure of science. Sometimes it's not always pointed out to them that some of the techniques of visualization for science are in fact nothing more than artistic conventions. You probably all in this room remember at school lines of force around magnets with iron filings.
Gets you started on that, it's ridiculous.
Yes, I mean, if ever there was a dangerous experiment, it was that one, because it makes people think in terms of distinct lines, but of course it's field densities that are much more relevant there. Any other?
Good evening, thanks first of all for the presentation. The slide that you had, I think it was the second to last one up, where you talk about legitimisation of useless commodity. I think it's the one this one here. I actually work in an ad agency, and if you showed that at a marketing conference, you'd probably have a lot of people actually nodding, and actually the lexicon would be slightly different than they used to discuss it, but it actually defines a very real commercial problem that advertising and marketing actually finds itself in from a reductive point of view. So answers that you actually have to get out of that reductive process actually have real commercial as well as artistic and scientific and social value.
It's an interesting and very messy area, I think, and I'm sure that if a number of you guys are no doubt practicing artists, trying to find ways of interacting with the human world, i.e. people, and the commercial elements of the world are extremely difficult. In many respects, it makes science look easy. I agree entirely with you, yes.
Okay, Toby, good.
Thank you very much for the talk. Very, very rich and interesting. I may have not understood it, so apologies if I'm not clever enough in it. This question seems foolish. Given this sort of context of the metaphor as a point of knowledge transference, as a way to bring together these different views of the world, is there a danger that by focusing on the sort of intellectual, epistemological nexus as part of this model, that you're negating the kind of issue about subjective-objective? I was very interested when you started off by positing this as a sort of subjective model. If we think of, in the most sort of broad brushstroke, scare quotes way, science is looking for something objective. Surely by bringing in the physicality, bringing the embodiment, bringing in to use a Heideggerian term, being in the world, that sort of kind of phenomenological context, aren't you therefore making it more subjective on the art side? Isn't that distancing it with a focus of something else?
What I'm trying to show is that the notion of objectivity and subjectivity as polarised extremes, that is something that is entirely a property of an object and something that's entirely the property of the process of the subject, isn't necessarily useful in this context, because after all we're talking about human understanding immersed within a world of objects external to us, and so I think science has sort of clung on to this notion of objectivity because in a way it sort of gives it protection. They can say, no, you can't criticise what this is objective, when in fact very rarely does the notion of objectivity come up as being a necessity within science. Triangulation of information to provide stable knowledge, yes, but that is not trying to make a distinction between objective and subjective.
And we all know that the grey area in between those binaries is the most interesting and nuanced area. I think we'll have to end it there. Thank you very much, Brett, Toby, very rich talk.